said, "The angels of fear, sorrow, and death stood by my side since the day I was born." His father was a poorly paid Norwegian army physician stationed at the garrison at the entrance to Oslo harbour. He had a nervous temperament and was prone to bouts of depression, and he was also morbidly religious. He thought his son would do well as an engineer, although Edvard, as a youngster, was often sickly and spent much of his time in bed drawing. His father, at the age of 16, enrolled him in the technical college in Christiania for a course in engineering, but at the end of a year he dropped out and declared to his father that he really wanted to be a painter. Reluctantly, his father enrolled him in the Christiania Academy of Fine Arts, and there he did his course. And then he said, "It was from my father I inherited the seeds of madness." One of his earliest paintings was of his younger sister, Inger. And what is so curious about the northern climes is the blue light that suffuses through absolutely everything towards late afternoon, evening, well into almost the midnight hours. And here you can see that blue light reflecting off Inger's dress, sitting there introspectively, looking straight ahead, caught in a moment of silence. But there's something slightly uneasy about that painting to my eye. Can you see the rocks in front of her there that are highlighted? It's almost as if we can see a nose and a face and an eye, as if those two rocks there, just by her hat, had slithered out of the fjord onto the shore to join their fellows. He was so haunted by the death of his oldest sister, Sophie, that 8 years later, when he painted her no fewer, from his memory, the recollections of her in her last days, painted her no fewer than 5 times. And here's one of those 5 paintings. You can see Sophie there, gaunt, eyes sunken, hair matted with sweat, propped up in a chair with pillows. And there is her aunt, head bowed, clasping her hand. And as the end approaches, he recalls this scene. We can just catch a glimpse of Sophie. Can you see in the chair there? We just see the white of the pillow and her left arm and hand. And behind her, her father, his hands in prayer, head bowed. Edvard remembers he couldn't really stomach that scene at all, and he simply had to turn away. And there he is, right at the left-hand side near the top there. Do you see? Just about to go out of the room. And as Sophie breathes her last in her chair, you can see the figures staring at us there with mask-like faces, frozen in time. And I think all of us who've experienced a family bereavement in the last moments know that at that moment, time does indeed stop. He did well at his art school, and he was given a scholarship to spend 3 weeks in Paris, which he enjoyed, and he came back to Christiania, and then subsequently resolved to go back to Paris, which he did when he was 26 years old. And he took a room in Saint-Cloud, and he remained in Paris for 8 months, painting and seeing what he could pick up. And there he learnt that his father had also died. And that led him to paint this picture here, in the semi-darkness, a window, and in the far distance there you can just make out the lights of Paris reflecting off the Seine. And at the window is a shadowy figure, a man with a top hat, perhaps his father that he never really knew. And in this mood of melancholy, he painted this scene as well. And here is a figure, a friend of his modelling, but it could easily have been Edvard himself, in the corner there, looking glum, melancholic. The sky looking streaky, a little bit ominous, I think. Now, without a father, without a mother, and having lost his sister and one in a mental institution, he was really desperate from the financial point of view. So he approached his father's family for some financial support, but they really turned their back on him. And so he went off to Berlin. Why Berlin? Because some young art students that he had met at the Art Academy in Christiania had gone to gone to Berlin and set up a little studio themselves, and there were paintings, so they invited him to join him there. And he went there and spent 4 years in Berlin. And yet interesting, while he was in Berlin, he did hardly any paintings of Berlin at all, even though it was a vibrant place at the time. What he did was reflected upon his native Christiania. And again, that blue light that tinged Inga we saw on the beach comes to dominate much of his painting as he recalls his time there. Here we have a late evening, summer evening scene. Light is blue again. We see the fjord right at the top on the left there. Can you see the boats, three little golden boats, people out boating well past 11 o'clock at night, one would suspect. And that strange white column that bisects the picture from the top there is in fact the reflection of the moon, but here looking perhaps a little phallic, one might suggest. And there is this girl, young lady, thrusting herself towards us, arms behind her back, face part in shadow. For there, in Berlin, he was thinking back, and somehow his memories were bringing to the surface his inherent anxieties. And many of his anxieties were sexual in nature. And I think this is the first example of that. And then a little later on, he paints this scene, which he calls the Dance of Life. Again, we see the moon almost on the horizon. Can you see there at the back? Its reflection on the fjord now, looking like a sentinel standing guard over what's taking place on the green above the beach there. And on the left, with her golden red hair, you can see his first love, dressed in white and gold. And there in the center, she now wears red, the color of passion, dancing with Munch. But look how stiffly he holds her. In fact, he doesn't hold her to him, he holds her away from him. Contrast that with the figures swirling around in the background there. Can you see arms around each other, and towards the right there, that man with a lecherous look on his face is clearly enjoying the experience. And yet, to his right, there is the same lady again, now in black, the love that was not to be. And then the kiss, furtive, almost in darkness, just a little chink of light where the curtain is open, you can see there, but we never see the faces of the lovers. And then, with head bowed and ashen face, he leans forward as she approaches him to give him what he thinks will be a kiss in his neck, but it's nothing of the sort. She's biting into his neck, drawing blood, a vampire, her hair Medusa-like, clutching her to him. Clutching him to her, I should say. And yet again, here in a painting he called Ashes, we see a midnight clearing in the wood, the moonlight there, lighting up this woman, her white dress open well beyond the waist to see a flash of red. Hands on her head, staring straight at us, while the figure on the left of the corner, Munch almost certainly, ashen-faced, head bowed. Behind her, we can see white rocks. Can you see in the clearing in the wood there, looking like a bed? For there on the right-hand side near the bottom is one that looks like a pillow. And this is how he conceived of this moment. Why ashes? Because his love is turning to ashes, and to make the point, at the bottom is a log of wood smouldering, and up the left-hand side of the frame you can see the smoke meandering up towards the top. And then the final separation. Well, gosh, that really is heavy stuff, isn't it? But this is Edvard Munch. His sexual anxieties were clearly very important. And he never married. Here he paints himself in this portrait, framed at the bottom there, you can see, by some bones, dry and lifeless. He did have one romantic relationship as far as we know, and that was with this woman, Tula Larsen. She was an upper-class, liberated woman who took a shine to Edvard, so much so that they were together for nearly 2 years, traveling around Europe, but they constantly seemed to have arguments, mainly, why wouldn't he marry her? And he kept shying off and saying, well, not yet, let me think about it, not yet. No, I don't think I can. I'm not well enough to marry. I'll make a bad husband. And indeed, he was now beginning to drink. On one occasion, during one row, he took out a revolver and he put his hand up and he shot and fired and blew off part of 2 fingers, one of which had to be formally amputated. Either in a fit of remorse or self-pity, he subsequently painted this, a man lying on the bed, no doubt Munch himself, blood-soaked bed, naked, his love now, her back towards him, and he called this picture The Death of Marat, after Jacques-Louis David's famous picture of Marat lying stabbed in the bath, you remember. And Marat, of course, was one of the great heroes of the French Revolution. So here he is, a martyr to his unrequited love, or requited love, but one he wouldn't accept. So apart from his sexual anxieties, there were other anxieties too. And here he depicts a figure at night, the moonlight picking up the wicker fence, and a figure with a mask-like, ghost-like face, behind whom you would think is a shadow. But the shadow doesn't quite fit, because the moon would be much higher than the figure, and the shadow would be low down. This is another figure, we don't know who, approaching from behind. And then a procession of figures, ghost-like, hollow-eyed, again the blue of the late Nordic summer evening, advancing towards us, all the house lights on now, marching towards us relentlessly. And now a procession just coming towards us, winding its way along a path. He said the sky has turned blood red, and he said it's a procession of death, at the end of which lies the grave. And then, of course, the procession consists just of one person, hands held against the ears to keep out the sound of a piercing scream. He later wrote how he came to paint this picture. He said, "It was on a walk with 2 friends at sunset. I felt a breath of melancholy. Suddenly the sky turned blood red. I stopped and leant against the railing, deathly tired, looking across at the flaming clouds that hung like blood and a sword over the bluish-black fjord and town. My friends walked on. I stood, now trembling with anxiety, and then heard the enormous, infinite scream of nature." He did a lot of self-portraits, and here we see a self-portrait of Munch looking older than the 40 years he was at the time this was done, because drink was taking its toll. And significantly, he's painted himself in an almost empty restaurant with an empty bottle of wine there on the table. Drinking had become so much a problem that he was now having hallucinations. He was picking arguments with strangers in the streets and even getting into brawls. And it was disturbing his friends to such a degree that they arranged for him to be admitted to Dr. Christiansen's psychiatric clinic in Copenhagen, where he remained for 8 months. And there, on a regime of fresh air, some exercise, some light electrical stimulation to the muscles of the legs, he was much better, and eventually left, writing a gracious letter to Dr. Jacobson, writing a gracious letter to Dr. Jacobson, thanking him for putting him back together again. He lived on for another 37 years, doing mostly portraits, self-portrait after self-portrait, more even than Rembrandt. And here we catch him in his old age, in his late 70s, peering at us suspiciously, because he lived like a hermit in a sparsely furnished room, you can see there, the blue light coming through the window. And he called this painting 1:45 in the morning, which was presumably when he painted it. He later wrote, "The second part of my life has been nothing but a struggle to keep myself upright, on a path alongside an abyss. This fear of life has hounded me ever since I could first think. My art was a telegram warning of disaster." Munch died in 1944 whilst Norway was still under Nazi occupation, and a year later the German army surrendered to the Norwegian forces. What then was the nature of Munch's underlying mental condition, and to what extent do we think the Nordic climate could have influenced this in some way? And the latter part is pure speculation, but I would put it to you that certainly the blue that we see permeating many of his paintings had something to do with it, and we're going to see the blue recurring again and again in the other artists we're going to look at this morning. Firstly, he inherited, as he voluntarily said himself, the depression of his father, but also had this great anxiety, which was his dominant psychiatric problem, I think. Not helped, of course, by his alcoholism. And I think that's as far as we can get with the underlying diagnosis of Edvard Munch, but clearly a highly disturbed man. Just as an aside, I was amused to read a review of an exhibition currently taking place in, I'm not sure if it's in Europe or in the United States now, and the exhibition is called Edvard Munch, a Landscape Painter. And I fully accept that I've selected images here to make a point, because we're talking about art genius and madness. But looking at the paintings and reading the review, and I haven't yet received the catalogue, which I'm going to read assiduously, I think these are little things, but I would still submit that even if you go to that exhibition, you would argue, as I do, that the picture that I presented to you of Edvard Munch's psychological state is the dominant one, and the landscapes were almost incidental. I think, in fairness, if you're a curator of a museum, you're obliged to keep coming up with new ideas. How are you going to present the artist who's been presented so many times before in so many great museums around the world? So you have to come up with something new. And I suspect that's what that was all about. And all credit to them for thinking of it, but I don't think that is the dominant message about Edvard Munch. In addition to the scenery, the climate, I think another factor comes into what motivated Nordic artists, and that is an awareness of their political situation and how out of their political situation they would forge a national identity. We have to realize, we're all products of our history, and for the Norwegians particularly, no exception. Because for 400 years, Scandinavia, the dominant power in Scandinavia was little Denmark. This is a contemporary map from all that time ago, and a little Denmark sticking up like a finger right at the bottom of the screen there was the dominant political and military power for 400 years in this region, absorbing Norway to the north, Iceland and Greenland to the west, and even for a while, Sweden to the east. Denmark, though, found itself allied to France and on the wrong side during one of the Napoleonic Wars, and in 1805 was defeated by the British and consequently had to cede much of its colonial territory. The hapless King Frederick VI of Denmark yielded Norway to the wily Crown Prince of Sweden, Bernadotte, and thus Norway was acquired, having been a colony of Denmark, had now become a colony of Sweden. The Swedish government allowed the Norwegians to hold a constituent assembly in order to write a constitution which allowed them a limited amount of autonomy. But for the next 90 years, the proud Lion of Norway remained firmly under the Swedish crown. How did artists respond to this continual occupation, if you like, of their homeland? Well, at the beginning of the first half of the 19th century, they very much emulated the work of Albert Bierstedt, the American painter, you remember, who did romantic images of the American West as the Americans were traveling towards the Rocky Mountains. They were bowled over by the splendor of the scenery and the geography of their newly discovered country. And so here we have Adolf Tiedemann, an early 19th century Norwegian painter, very much in Bierstedt's manner, romanticizing the Norwegian countryside as a means of establishing a Norwegian identity. And here we see a wedding party going out on an inlet from the fjord, the afternoon sun glinting off the snow-capped mountains in the background. And here at night we see harpoon fishing by the light of a flaming torch on the bow of their little boat. So a romantic image of Norway was how artists tried to convey their national identity. But for Finland it was different. The Finns had been under domination for 400 years, not by Denmark, but by Sweden itself. Yet, for all that time, they were constantly looking warily towards the east, where the Russian bear lurked. And indeed, Russians had made many, many excursions into Finland over those years, occupying the country for periods of time and then withdrawing, until in 1809, occupied Finland and annexed it into the greater Russian Empire. And thus, for the next 100 years until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Finland was part of Russia. How did the Finnish artists deal with this situation? And they dealt with it by conjuring up a great epic written called the Kalevala. And for those of you familiar with the music of Jan Sibelius, many of his tone poems pick out scenes from this great epic, comprising no fewer than 20,000 verses and songs in which Finnish heroes do heroic deeds to deliver the nation from its enemies. And here the Finnish painter Akseli Gallen-Kallela depicts one of these heroic deeds in a very heroic manner, as you can see from the style. That was the Finns' answer to create this, if you like, creation mythology of Finland as an entity. The Norwegians had a softer approach. They were still enchanted by the mystique of the northern lights, the swirling mists, the mountain streams, and for them, their country was altogether a softer place and less harsh. And for them, they developed a mythology that was altogether more folksy, populated by trolls. And as we all know, trolls are ugly little bad-tempered creatures who live under rocks and in caves. They have no time for humans and are therefore best avoided. Norway, right up to the beginning of the 20th century, was largely a rural society, very much bound together by the Lutheran Church and its teachings of simplicity. And that is reflected in the art of Norwegian artists at the beginning of the 20th century. And here we have a painting by Erik Werenskjold, two young girls in traditional dress looking out over the farm, and he calls this painting simply September. In next-door Sweden, the painter Anders Zorn here commemorates a village dance to commemorate the midnight sun on Midsummer's Day, a tradition that was being re-established as a means of asserting Sweden's independence as well. And then we come back to this blue, which haunts everything about the Nordic art, I think. From space, the winter in the Scandinavia in winter looks absolutely stunning, as you can see from the International Space Station. But on the ground, things are much more harsh and severe. Clear days in winter are rare and short. And as the night falls, everything's covered in this mystical blue, tinged with pink. So much so that for painter Harold Solberg here, on the rare clear winter nights, the snow-clad mountains seem almost mystical in their appearance. For the Danish painter P.S. Krøyer, the blue light of summer was altogether on a much lighter vein. And he painted many, many canvases depicting the blue light, reminiscent of Munch and painting Inger on the beach, you remember, with the blue light tinging her white dress. And here is a mother and daughter walking together on the edge of the water, on the beach. And there, two young boys frolicking late at night in the summer by the light of the moon. And yet somehow there's something a little disquieting, I think you would agree, about that scene. It's unnatural to our eyes, and I would suspect it's a little bit spooky even if you're there and used to it. And here a couple walking their dog at that same late evening hour in summer. But for Holberg, he was concerned the light of the summer evenings haunted him rather than just being a little bit eerie. So much so that as the light began to fade, you can see the trees looming up towards us as if about to engulf us. And so it was for Prince Eugen. Prince Eugen was the second son of Oscar II of Sweden, who was a respected painter in his own right. And for Prince Eugen, the trees, the Nordic summer trees, as the light faded finally, seemed to develop a life of their own. Playing with the mind, I think you would agree. For Edith Peterson was rare among Nordic painters who found a romantic imagery in this light. And here in the early summer evening, we can see the moon reflected in the water, and it looks like a romantic, exciting image. But for Kitty Keeland, that twilight time was one of introspection, of stillness and contemplation. Likewise for the Swedish painter Richard Berg. At that moment of stillness, conversation stops. All is silent, and we're left alone with our thoughts. What thoughts, I wonder, are going through the mind of this young girl with her parasol as she's walking along the path and comes across two empty chairs? What thoughts are going through the mind of this lady on the right there in the pew of a church, painted by one of the only female painters of the time, Harriet Becker, with her high hat there, leaning forward out of the pew in order to see a mother and her daughter carrying a baby up for a christening. The greater part of the painting is occupied by empty space. It's the space of the thought of what is going on. And here again, Harriet intrudes on a woman reading a book, and the light reflecting off the curtain and the window there and the wall and the stove, so that we don't disturb her in her privacy while she's reading. Perhaps the master of the silence was Wilhelm Hammershøi, the Danish painter, who was a great admirer of Jan Vermeer. And here is Hammershøi in a self-portrait painted in this oval mirror. And you can see his wife is now going out of the room to leave him alone. Hammershøi, apart from being very much enamored of Vermeer, was also very taken by James Whistler's portrait of his mother, with which I'm sure you're familiar. And this famous painting of Whistler, mother in her black there, sitting in a chair, looking a bit stony-faced, straight ahead, a little decoration on the curtain, a picture behind her, a little bit of another picture on the right-hand side there, is really all in a very subdued palette of muted greys, in keeping with the mood of introspection. Hammershøi now paints his mother and takes this a level further. And there is Hammershøi's mother. Same pose, mirror image, but gone are the decorations on the curtain, gone are the pictures on the wall. She's just left alone with her thoughts. And here we see the back of a lady, perhaps his wife, tray under her arm. He allows himself just a little colour, can you see on the dresser there, on the left, and on the picture frame. But we don't want to disturb her. So instead, we look at the vase, the bowl, on the table there with the blue leaves, can you see? That's where our attention is directed, because we don't want to intrude on her privacy. And again here, she reads a letter, but she's a little bit blurry off to the side, because that's where she is. That's not where we should be. We should be in the next room where the light is, can you see, so we don't disturb her. And again here, she's at her desk reading, but almost as an afterthought, because this is a painting of the sunlight streaming through the window, forming a pattern on the floor. And now he goes a step further still. He removes her, the desk, the chair, the paintings, the drapes on the window, and he comes back at night and paints the same room in moonlight. How do you paint moonlight? Well, there you are. None of these painters had any, as far as we know, psychological disturbance other than Edvard Munch, but 4 Nordic painters most certainly did. The first of these is the Danish painter Laurits Andersen Rink, who came from a farming family, lived in a small village, and almost his entire output was of the village life that he knew around him in Denmark. And here he depicts an old man with a heavy bag of seed, which he's now sowing, can you see, walking heavily with a limp in his heavy clogs. Laurits Andersen was educated at the Danish Academy of Art and Design, the Royal School of Art in Copenhagen, but was prone to bouts of severe depression, often in and out of hospital. And here he paints a ploughed field on which have descended a flock of black crows. And tomorrow we'll be meeting Van Gogh, who painted an almost identical image, the crows being the harbingers of death. And here he paints an old woman wrapped up against the winter cold, sitting in the graveyard, and we're left to wonder what she's thinking about. And then as the light finally fades, black clouds loom over, the house on the hill there, the tree, seems to loom over us, like it did before with those trees we could see in the light. And here is a woman now with her apron, sitting on her bundle on the roadside, looking down, tired, and over her is hovering the figure of death. A second artist who had, we don't know what his mental state was, but he lived like a recluse, and you may be forgiven for thinking this picture was painted by Vincent van Gogh. But in fact, he was Eugene Jensen, who was born in Stockholm and barely ever left the city. And almost all his paintings were done at night. And here, as the sun finally fades, the sky becomes streaky. And as the lights come on, the houses on either side seem to loom in strange shapes. And here again, the sky is streaky, looking across at Stockholm, the lights on the shore there, and as we approach the lights on the left and on the right-hand side, we can see they begin to swirl. And here in another painting, they seem to be disappearing in the foreground into a vortex. Again, calling to mind Vincent van Gogh's Starry Sky. And you would think as the sun came up, one of very few daylight paintings that Jensen ever did, as the sun would come up, you would think we would be warmed by what we were looking at, but in fact just the contrary. This makes me feel even colder. You can see the smoke from the chimneys rising up, the snow on the roofs there, and the sun there looking anything but comforting. And then there's Erik Josephson, another Swede who had schizophrenia. And Josephson painted this picture of what he called a water sprite. Water sprites are happy little elf-like creatures that are bubbling around and dancing and full of joy. But for Josephson, the water sprite is very disturbed, a pained look on a naked boy's face, living in a cave, and behind him there appearing the heads of monsters. And another painting by Josephson here of a young girl with golden hair. It looks happy at first sight. You can see in her hand at the bottom there a golden cup, and on her elbow a butterfly. But she's turning her head away because she suddenly has a vision And in that vision, we see a sunburst, and in the center of the sunburst, we see the young Jesus child with the stigmata of the crucifixion to come on his feet. A picture that may well have been conceived by Blake. And then there is August Strindberg. August Strindberg, the Swedish playwright. You may be surprised to know that he was also an artist, having befriended artists, taken professional lessons in painting, producing over 100 works, many of which sold. His reputation, of course, was as a playwright, having built on the social realism of Ibsen. He added to Ibsen's characters greater psychological depth. But he himself was a wild man, Ibsen. He described himself as an iconoclast. Why? Because he said he was interested in everything, and he wanted to turn everything upside down so he could see what was underneath. He was thrice married and also put on trial for blasphemy. He also suffered from psychotic episodes. And in fits of depression, in addition, when he could no longer write and had writer's block, that's when he took up his canvases and his paintbrush. And the sort of paintings he did were like this, turbulent paintings, as you can see. And then in his moments of psychosis, when he saw visions, a sunny glade, as you can see, with flowers there, and there he described that as being the symbol of what his voices were telling him. His voices were telling him that he was put on earth to lead mankind to a better world. The sort of grandiose imagery, I think, that we saw with Blake. Was this schizophrenic? Not completely, I don't think, because he lived in the real world, but we can see how that diagnosis keeps coming back and keeps coming back. And then he reverts to his seascapes, turbulent images at every turn. So how do we put all this together in terms of the Nordic psyche? Well, I would put it to you that the climate and the countries and the terrain certainly has something to do with it. The long blue summer nights, the dark winters. Psychiatrists call depression in that sort of environment, what do they call it? They call it, that's right, seasonal affective disorder. Well, surveys have been done because the question arises, is the incidence of seasonal affective disorder or overt depression higher in the Nordic countries than elsewhere? And in order to answer that question, a survey was actually done in Norway and in Sweden, and it seemed that at least 10 to 15% of the population suffered from seasonal affective disorder, compared with recent figures out of the United States where the figure was around 5%. But then, of course, the United States ranges from Alaska to Hawaii, so you wouldn't expect the same conditions to prevail in the nation. What about the incidence of major depressions? And there, if you turn to the World Health Organization data, you find that the incidence of severe depression in the Scandinavian countries is no higher than that recorded for Britain, the United States, or South Africa, which is surprising. Yet, I'm going to put it to you that among the artists that we've seen today, we've seen 5 who had major psychological problems, diagnoses. Those 5 were culled from a combined population of Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway at the turn of the century of no more than perhaps 10 million people. Now, I ask you, can you think of any artists, anything like that number, in France, in Italy, or in Spain, who had that percentage of psychological disorder? And so, although statistically I cannot make a case that the Nordic climate and the Nordic psyche has influenced It certainly influenced the Nordic painting. I think you would agree with that. But does that translate into increased incidence of psychological illness? Statistically, my case is unproven. But that figure, 5 out of 10 million versus 1 or 2 out of a population of what? Italy at the turn of the century, 35 million, Spain similar, Britain 40 million. We're looking at hundreds of millions of people. So I think there's something there, and statistics are what you make it. Now, today I'm going to apologize to you because I've shortchanged you, and I'd like to turn the lights on and really have some feedback, because I've done all the talking for the last 3 days. I know a lot of you had a lot of questions to ask. So would you allow me to do that if I were to stop for a few minutes early so that I could get your comments? Would anybody, please don't let me detain you if you wanted to have an early lunch, but I really feel I've shortchanged you a little bit. And yes, please, could you speak up because I'm geriatric? It does indeed, doesn't it? Yes. I'm not qualified to answer that in any definitive way, but I made the same observation. I think 3 out of the 4 people that we've spoken about in the last 3 or 4 days all lost their mothers very, very early on. We think of poor old Van Gogh, for example, with his 9 sisters. I don't know if there are any psychiatrists in the audience. Are there people? Is there anybody with a psychiatric background? Because what I'm going to be bringing together tomorrow is the argument that obsessive-compulsive disorder, autism, creativity, and schizophrenia all belong on the same spectrum. And when we talked yesterday about the hard wiring of the brain and how little we know about it, I just wonder if in the fullness of time we're going to find out there is in fact a neurophysiological link between these conditions. Anyway. Well, let me not thank you all very much for coming, and I apologize for the short change today, but tomorrow we will make up.